You are an educator. You have a choice of virtual worlds. You can go where you choose. What makes SpotOn3D.com different? Our easy press tools make presentation native. Easy inventory go from grid to grid. Universal registration. Universal avatars. EduMerge and micro-community. Community conference center. 100 people on a cloud. Free forever accounts with 5 avatars. Premium membership with full production level skills. Protection. SpotOn3D.com. Different. Hello and welcome to GRIDwrap, and today we're talking about information and misinformation, and to that end we've invited along Sheila Yoshikawa of Information Literate. You've got over your head, Sheila Yoshikawa.
And indeed I am.
Yeah, you are indeed, and I couldn't think of anybody better to invite along. Of course we have our co-host Tessa Harrington here of Spot on 3D. So
Hello, everyone.
Sheila, sorry, darling, I am rather pushing it along. We've had a few technical problems at this end, so we've started a moment or two late. So, Sheila, how do we tell correct information from the wrong information on the net?
Well, I suppose we have to use our brains to try and distinguish what's good and what's not so good. I think, well, I suppose one thing is that sometimes it doesn't matter so much. Well, it's also knowing when it's actually important to try and sift the what's true from what's not true. Would you like to give us sort of a specific example of something you were thinking about?
Well, in my area in Second Life, which is to do with media and the news, often we get reports of things happening. We have to research all the way back to check those reports. But sometimes we can't actually do that. And so a blogger will put out some information. For example, Second Life or Linden Labs being bought out by Microsoft. And, excuse me a minute, I'm just going to move my mic. There we go. Linden Labs being bought out by Microsoft. That was actually put out by one blogger, and within moments that had gone viral. And we never really got to the bottom of it. We can make all sorts of surmises, all sorts of rumours, and some people might have information that they can't divulge, but we can't actually get to the bottom of it. And when you trace it back, it seemed to come from one blogger whose motives may not have been entirely altruistic.
So it sounds to me like actually you've just described what the thing is to do, which is to try and go back to the original source, find out where it came from, and then think, can I trust this source? I mean, it would have been obvious to you as well that the way to check it out ultimately was to try and find someone trusted in Linden Lab or Microsoft who could actually say yay or nay. But obviously in that kind of situation where it involves commercial confidence, then you know that you're not always going to get the straight answer.
We went to Microsoft, for example, and they didn't even know, or appeared to not know, their press people, because that was who we could get hold of. And they went to search for truth and came back with the quote, Microsoft so basically doesn't concern itself speculating about rumour, which is fair enough, or commenting on speculation, in fact, which was fair enough. But we never did get to the bottom of speculation, and it didn't make the speculation any less dangerous, actually, to Linden Labs.
No, and I suppose that's a situation where if you were a competitive intelligence professional, and you probably know that there are people who actually specialize in that area, and they emphasize very much that they are very ethical and that they have rules that they follow in order to keep legally in business. But I suppose that's the point at which it would go out of sort of checking things which are in the public domain and starting to phone people up or tweet or try and get hold of their mobile phone number to try and get them at a vulnerable point. I've certainly heard competitive intelligence professionals talking about sort of various techniques of how there are certain days of the week, times of the day when people are more likely to respond, and there are certain ways of getting information out of people that you pretend that you've got some information already and try and set it up so they think they're just confirming something rather than actually giving you new things that you don't know about already. So it sounds to me as if you actually trawled through all the sources that are likely to come out of Linden Lab, come from Microsoft. If you sort of followed up the employees who might give you a straight story, then you're probably into that area of actually trying to contact people individually and piece together the story that way.
But what happens? Sorry, Tessa, go on.
Well, there are some that said this actually didn't harm Second Life so much because it drew a lot of attention to them as to say, hey, we're for sale and we're interested in being bought, So I can't really say that this was terribly damaging to Linden Labs, but it does kind of point out that if it had been some other type news, it could have definitely had the potential to. But the question is, if it's Microsoft, you're not going to get that kind of volume. Probably.
No, I mean, it might be that Linden Lab actually put out the rumour, of course. I mean, presumably you've thought of that already.
Yeah,
that's the sort of thing that smaller companies sometimes do to make it look like they're really attractive.
Right.
Well, I don't know about this because it did have a rather unsettling effect on the residents of Linden for Second Life. So, in that sense, and they're quite vulnerable at the moment anyway because there've been a lot of changes to and fro about things. So it didn't make it any easier being in here watching the panic rising, the idea that Microsoft might come in and take all their content away. So, but basically, is the internet a place for reliable information?
Well, I think the answer is yes. Yes and no. I mean, there's a huge amount of reliable information out there. And I think it's silly to say, just ignore everything. I mean, even in sort of serious subject areas like health and so forth, there's some really first-class information there that you can get hold of.
But then there's some really questionable stuff, too.
So what is the questionable stuff, Tessa?
I would have to say the biggest culprit is forums, and I think that's why you saw earlier this year, WoW trying to apply Real ID to their user forums because of the infighting that you see in a lot of these forums. You've heard the word troll and such. But they recently rescinded their decision to use Real ID in the forums as a way to force people to recognize who they are on their real account. They have a similar setup as us where you have a key account that holds your passwords to all your game accounts with all the Blender games, because of course Blender has multiple games, Blizzard I should say. And what they were doing was saying, if you want to post to forums, you're going to expose your first name of your Battle.net key account. And people were in an uproar. But I think they were doing this because there was so much infighting and trolling. Trolling is the act of basically baiting people and saying whatever you have to get them upset. And I don't quite understand the need to do that. I don't think it's really constructive, and I'm sure the WoW people didn't either. And that's why they considered doing this Real ID and apply it to the forums to try to cut out on some of it. But I'm not a forum rat, so I'm not terribly familiar with the motivations behind it, but I'm sure there's lots. But that's another area I know that's just rampant with it.
There's that's come up with the idea of display names in Second Life, hasn't it, as well? With people saying that the opportunity to put on display names means that you might be posing as someone else. It doesn't necessarily guarantee any sort of authenticity. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting in different communities. There's sort of different etiquette. For example, in the educators community, there's quite a lot of pressure to announce who you are in real life a lot of the time. And that's seen, and I can understand that very much. For example, when if I'm inviting someone to work with my students, I feel I do have an obligation to actually find out a lot about them because that's a responsibility to my students. But otherwise, just in terms of I'm, for example, inviting people to speak on my island. If I think they're interesting and having something to say, I don't really bother about what they do outside Second Life. I'm just judging them by what they do inside Second Life. But some people I know would really not even do something like that, or wouldn't even want to get friends with someone unless they knew who they were outside Second Life.
Right.
So it seems to be.
What do you feel about that, Sheila? I mean, you've said that, it doesn't really concern you, but to make a judgment in a sense about, because there can be quite a lot of pressure to give up your real life to people. And I've come across things where people have said, well, I think people are liars, or it's not transparent, or, I've had this a lot, actually, if I've been asked about my real life, and I really don't consider that I need to bandy it about so much, because I find what I do in here rather more interesting. So it's, I was just thinking that, but nevertheless, quite a lot of people have sort of called me all sorts, or, said, well, you'll have to do this when that happens and all that. But actually, really, is the information that I give in here and the way that I behave as important as who I am in real life, or more important, or not important at all?
And personally, I think for what you do in Second Life, what you do in Second Life is the most important thing. I think it's actually more dangerous when you get, for example, people posing as real life doctors on the internet, sort of when it's actually some kind of scam, for example, or just a power trip, because you do get people posing as experts. I think because people tend to, if they see a website and it's Dr. So-and-so on the internet, the tendency would be to assume that that really was a real life doctor. Whereas if you're in sort of World of Warcraft or Second Life, you go in and you know what some of the rules of the game are, so to speak. I don't think Second Life's actually a game, but you know what I mean. And you are there as an avatar. So it doesn't seem so much of a problem to me that people don't necessarily want to say what they're doing outside Second Life.
Well, on that note, I mean, we've brought in people who pose as being professional. Now, whether it's in a virtual world, whether it's, in Spot on 3D or in Second Life or out on the net, how can you find out whether somebody is a professional? We know that there are all sorts of sort of very upset people outside looking for help, and they will stumble over groups, or they will stumble over people posing as psychiatrists or psychologists or counsellors or therapists of some kind, or selling them stuff. I mean, we've come to know that sort of capital letters mean you really have to check that website. It just, for some reason, there's something about the capital letters that draws your attention to it. Might be a flaky website.
I mean, I think it's easier sort of from that point of view outside Second Life. For example, if you've got a sort of a doctor's website, they'll normally try and give some kind of qualifications, and quite often you can check up to see, particularly if they're claiming to be, I mean, like in the UK, a member of the British Medical Association, you could actually check that up. Similarly, if they're making various claims about, they've sort of consulted here, or they've given talks there, or they've written this book or this article, you can actually go up and you can check up on that if you want to. If you've got the name that they're giving, you can be sort of looking for where that name has come up. Is it actually in the places where you'd expect to see information about a doctor of the kind that they say they are?
And in Second Life, is it less obvious?
I know. I've had people walk up to me, say I'm a professor or I'm doing this, and you get into talking to them, and it's like, well, no, I've learned to ask. Are you talking about a real life university? Are you talking about a real life school? Are you talking about, a real life business? Because there are so many people